Hey there, Nick Genetacus here. In this video, we're going to go over a Python script that lets you increment file names starting at a specific number. So, for example, I have an empty directory here other than the Python script that we're about to go over, and I'm just going to paste in a touch command that I have from off screen here, which is going to create a whole bunch of number-ordered files. So let's go over the why here before we actually go over not only using the script, but also going over the source code. And if you don't care about the why, you can always jump through in the timestamps. So in my specific use case, I had 175 images that were very similar to this type of file format, where I had them numbered like 001, 002, and then I had a descriptive file name for all the images. And while I was writing these image file names, I'm a human being. I made a mistake, and I didn't notice this until I named all the files. But at number 67, I ended up just duplicating 67 twice. So basically, all of the files starting from 67 and above were all off by 1. They were too little because 67 were duplicated twice. So that led me to doing basically 3 things, I guess, right? Like 1, I could have sat there and very painstakingly went through all of these files and just renamed them one by one. That would have been super boring. I probably also could have done something with Vim. So, I've done some videos about this in the past with Vim, where if you have something like a number, you can hit Control A here to increment that number as many times as you want. So maybe there could have been some possibility of using like a Vim macro combined with that and bulk renaming to possibly solve the problem. But, I wasn't 100% sure how that would work. And that could have been easily like, oh yeah, that's going to be 15 minutes. And then it's like, oh crap, it's like 10 p.m., right? And it took the whole day. Another option maybe could have been just Googling around for some type of like power user tool that lets you do some type of like bulk renaming with some custom rules. I wasn't really sure what was available there. And then another option was just, cranking out a Python script to do the job, knowing full well that, yep, I'm pretty sure I can do this. I sort of knew the high level moving parts to make something like that work. And, I knew it wasn't going to take all day. Turns out it took me about 45 minutes in the end. And that's what this script is over here. So in this video, we're going to go over using the script. And by the way, it's not going to be an open source repo on GitHub, but I am going to throw it all up into a gist with instructions on how to get it up and running. And I'll make sure to link that in the description below. So let's go over, one more use case here besides like fixing duplicate numbers, right? This is the one we're going to focus on in this video at least. So let's say that you have these numbered list of files here and you just want to add a new one in between 3 and 4. So, I can just demonstrate here by being like, cool, like another entry here. And then if I ls here, we can see that we have it all set up, ready to go exactly where we want. But our problem now is that we have 1, 2, 3, then we have a duplicate 3 and 4, 5, 6. Like, this 3 needs to turn into a 4. That 4 needs to turn into a 5 until we get to the very end where this 9 turns into a 10. And that's, another reasonable use case for wanting to use such a script. So let's use the script to solve this problem. So we can just run it here by doing --help and see what's available. So number 1, we need to make sure that we pass in the path to where these files exist. So let me just go ahead and do this here, which is going to be the current directory, right, as a dot. Then we have some parameters or arguments that we could also set, which we do, by the way. Some of these are required. -I here is going to let us know when we want to start incrementing these files. Like for example, in our case from that example, we want to start incrementing at 3 because, we don't want to modify the like 0, 1 or 1 and 2, right? We want to start modifying at 3. Then the padding is going to be how much we want to 0 pad the prefix. And the prefix basically is the number. So, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 like this. If we did a padding of 2, then it's going to be like 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3. And a padding of 3 is going to be like this instead, right? So let's do a padding of 2 because we're going to have 10 entries in the end. And then finally, we also have optionally, this doesn't need to be set, this is a dry run, which is going to basically just print these results out instead of actually renaming the files on disk. So let's let that run and just see what happens, right? We can see for the first 2 that the number itself didn't change, like 1 is still 1, 2 is still 2, but they're all 0 padded now by 2, right? And just to give you an example, if I set that to a 3, now we can see we have like 0, 0, 1. That's great. So let me just go back to here and rerun it with 2. And then we can see like, our original 3 is still 3, which is really nice. Then we have our new file that we entered. That's no longer 3, right? Now it is 4. And then the old 4 is a 5, and the old 5 is a 6, and then finally the old 9 is a 10. So this new output looks really good. So let's just rerun this without doing a dry run. And then if I do an ls here, we can see that whatever was provided by the dry run now actually happened on disk. So all these files were renamed, and there it is. Like our extra one is now been inserted, and it's numbered correctly, and everything is good to go. So with that said, let's take a look here at this script. And, it's just another zero dependency Python CLI script using argparse. I've done plenty of videos now on this channel going over how to use argparse. And so I'm not going to focus on metavar and help and, setting up all these arguments. I'll leave a link to some stuff in cards if you want to check out or learn more about how to use argparse, specifically, creating CLI apps with Python, zero dependency. Because if you're going to use dependencies, click is also really good. But anyways, this all starts with, this increment files function. And we're just passing in, all the arguments that we have set up here that we need for this function, right? The path, the index, the delimiter. That's one thing I didn't go over, by the way. Let me just open up a new window here. If I do another inc file names here, help, there is this -d flag here, the delimiter. So if I go back and do an ls here, the delimiter here is hyphen. So you can see all of these have a dash. But, if your files are named like this instead, then your delimiter would be 2 underscores. So that is something that you can customize if you'd like. So let me just keep this open, but I'll just make it a little bit smaller. And so we have the delimiter, the pad length, the dry run, all of that. So let's go up to this function here and take a look here at what this does, right? Here's all our arguments being passed in. So the very first thing that we need to do is get a list of files, and we're going to pass in that source path. So if we take a look here at the list of files, if you've watched previous videos that I have, then you'll know that I am not a huge fan of list comprehensions. I find them a little bit hard to read. But this example was taken from Stack Overflow, and it does the job really well. So the real champion of this function is Python's built-in scander, where you can pass in a directory name. And by the way, we'll go over the sorted stuff in a second here. But if it weren't sorted, you can basically just do an os scander dir name here. And then what we're going to get back is a complete list of files. So going back down to here with the ls, in this specific case, it's going to have, this is going to be the first element in the list. That's going to be the second and third until we get to the very, very end. And we just use sorted here where we sort them by file name. So this is all, built into Python. Very nice stuff. And then that is going to give us this list of files. Now, next up, we need to loop over all of these files. Now, if you're used to working with loops in Python, then, you could probably expect to see something like for file in files. And, we totally could do that, and that would technically loop over the files, but that's not going to work in our exact use case because we need to pay attention to the index of the loop. So basically 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, we need to associate that number to the file that we're in. So we can use this built-in function with Python called enumerate, and then we can pass in our list of files there. And now when we loop over the list of files, we get access to both the file and the index. And since our numbers start at 1, we also want to make our index start at 1 instead of 0. And then next up, we just want to parse out the base name of the file. So I guess I can throw in a Python interpreter here just to go over how this works. So if I import os here and I make a new variable called something like temp hello and then cool file or something like that, right? And then we can do os.path, that base name on that variable, and we can see that we just get back the cool file, right? This part of the file name, right? Everything else about the path gets ignored. And that's all we really care about, right? We only care about the file name because that's the thing that we're renaming. We're not really necessarily adjusting the other parts of the path. So let me keep that open. So next up, once we have this file name, then, let's skip over files that don't have the delimiter in the file name. So for example, if I go here and do an ls, they actually all have this delimiter, including this one here. But let's say that we had a file called foo or whatever, right? This does not have the delimiter in the file name. And that's what this condition is handling. So if the delimiter is not in the file name, then let's just continue, where continue in Python is going to be you know what? Let's not execute the rest of this stuff here and just go back to the next item in the list. So basically just a way to skip things. Very handy. And then also after that, we have to start splitting things by the delimiter. So we have our file name, the base name, and then we're just going to run split, built into Python on our delimiter. And we're going to say, you know what? Let's actually just split this one time and no more. So let me jump back into a Python interpreter here. And let's just say that we have, do I still have A in here? Yeah, let me go back here and just make it like this without the path. So we have this, right? So we can do a.split and with no parameters at all other than the hyphen, and we get back this, right? Each item that was split becomes its own item in the list, right? So we have one and cool file. Great. But when we do split one here, then it is going to only split once. So we get the prefix here, which is, the number, and then everything else is part of the file name. And that's really, really, really handy because you might have a file like this, right? Where you have one and then like hello world, where technically the delimiter is in there multiple times, right? Yeah, so we just want to split it once. Great. So now we have the parts to this. Technically, I probably should have named this maybe like file name parts instead, but it's all good. We need the prefix, which again is that number, and then also the name, which is the rest of the file name like this. So cool, so we have that. And then next up, we need a little bit of protection here, right? That says, let's also ignore files that aren't going to have a prefix. So if I go back to the ls output here, then this is a good example of that, right? The prefix is, or the delimiter is in there, but inc is going to end up being the first item in that split, and inc clearly can't be incremented by 1, right? It's not an integer, so let's just protect against that and do a try except, and we'll say, hey, if we get a value error, which is what Python is going to throw, let's go and continue, which basically says skip this file and move on to the next one in the list. Then we need to start incrementing, and right now, let's just say, you know what, let's increment by nothing, let's not do anything by default. But then when we reach this one condition here that says, you know what, if the prefix, which really, prefix int is just an integer version of the prefix, right, turning it into a number, if that happens to be greater than or equal to the start index, and the start index, remember when we ran the command from the command line, that will be 3, like the -i flag. If this happens to be larger or, equal to than that index, then let's increment this amount by something. And we pass in, the index, current index from up here, right, in the loop. And that's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. And then the start index, right, which is going to be 3 in this case, we send that into a function that I wrote here called incby. And there's a couple comments here. We're going to go over them in a second, but let's just go to the logic of the function first. So let's begin by saying, you know what? Okay, cool. Let's increment by 1 by default. All right. And then if something happens, specifically if the current index, which is the first argument of the function here, if that happens to be equal to the start index, then we actually don't want to increment it by anything. And then we just return the amount. And then now we know for sure, like the amount that we want to increment it by. And to explain a little bit more how this works, like I have some comments up here. We can almost read them word for word because, I kind of wrote them as if I were to read them, like in my mind at least. So it's like, when adding an item, you'll end up with a duplicate number before you actually rename things. Like for example, we have this little list here, right? Like 1, 2, and 3. But now let's say that just like we did before, we just want to insert something in between 2 and 3. So you might do something like this, right? Where you have the original 3 here, but we just inserted this new one over here, right? And this is named 2, like something else. We just inserted that between 2 and 3. So what we actually really need to do is increment everything by 1, except when the current file in the loop matches the number we want to start renaming from. So in this case, it would have been 2, not 3, right? But we don't want this 2 to be bumped up to a 3. What we really want is this 2 to be bumped up by a 3, and then this 3 to be bumped up by a 4. So that's kind of what's happening here. And, that's kind of what this says over here, right? We need to increment everything by 1, except when the current file loop matches the number we want to start renaming from. And then just following through with the example, if we were to run this to completion, we'd end up with our ordered list of things here. But this also says that, this is kind of a limited approach, right? So up until now, we've only been dealing with like wanting to add one new file at a time. But like, going back to our example here, let me make this a little bit bigger. Like, let's just say I wanted to add like 3 files between 4 and 5. Like this formula or whatever is not going to work. So maybe at the end of this video, we'll go over, if you want to just practice some Python skills or whatever, maybe ways to enhance the script on your own if you wanted to do that just for practice. But anyways, yeah, like that's this function here, the incby one. Let me go back down to where we were before, which is over here. So we know we're either going to increment by 1 or 0. And now we need to basically create that new file name. So that starts with 1, taking the prefix integer amount, adding it to the increment amount, right? Like 2 is going to become 3, etc., etc. And then we convert that into a string. And now we have a string representation of that. We can start using string functions like zfill. And zfill is going to let us pop in some number. That's that flag over here where we put in 2 or 3 or whatever. And it's basically going to turn this like 1 into a 0, 1 or a 0, 0, 1. This is just built into Python. It's a really nice, handy function. And then we're just going to say like, okay, cool, the new file name, that is going to be the new prefix, which is this variable here, the delimiter, which is going to be a hyphen or whatever you passed in, plus the name of the file itself, which is the leftover parts from here. So we just basically assemble a new file. And then we say, okay, if we're doing a dry run, let's just print that out to the screen. Otherwise, we'll just use Python's built-in rename function here to rename the old name into the new name, and then we're done. And then it's back to the beginning, and we go through again and again and again until we run out of files to modify. And that's it. That's the whole entire script. There's really nothing else here. I mean, there's some argparse like checking if it's a positive integer, but all that stuff, I've went over before in previous videos. There's like a new one here, like check path, just make sure that the source path exists. Otherwise, it won't even let you run the script. So for example, if I run in file names here with like a path that's not going to exist, then it's going to say like, hey, you know what? I can't do anything, so let's just abort as early as possible. So yeah, that's how that script works. But now let's talk a little bit maybe about limitations of the script, right? And why I didn't decide to put this up on GitHub and go all in, like creating documentation and publishing a package and all this other stuff. So this really is a very specific use case, right? It's like when you want to either insert a new item in a list somewhere like this, or maybe, fix a duplicate like my image problem. But as we discovered here, like this is a pretty limited approach, right? Like when you want to add 3 things in the middle, then it's only going to ever get incremented by 1. Like it's just not going to work. So that's one improvement that you could potentially do if you'd like to have some challenge. And then another one is like, well, what about the opposite of incrementing? What about decrementing? Like, let's just say that for whatever reason, like I just want to remove this one. Then technically, like that 7 below here should change to a 6, and then the 8 will be a 7. So, what would that look like? Well, maybe renaming the script, it's no longer going to be inc file names. It's going to be maybe like adjust file names or something like that. Like maybe you can add a new flag here where you can pick either incrementing or decrementing as like a Boolean thing. That's a possibility. Another possible way to improve the script would be like, what happens if you want to modify directories, not files? So going back to this is file here, like this is going to be only filtered to files. Like, if you had directories here instead, like just you're not going to get anything there. So maybe another possible flag here would be like, do you want to have this operate on files or directories, or maybe both? Like, what about nested directories and recursively going through all of them? Like, these are potential things. But it gets to the point where it's like, well, I could totally have spent the whole entire like weekend or multiple days or whatever, however long it would have taken to implement all that, but I really didn't have that use case, so I didn't do it. Plus, at some point, it feels like if you need all that flexibility to modify files and directories, like moving things around, like what happens if you move a directory that was like 02 to like 07 or something, and all the files in there need to all be incremented as well? That starts to get really, really complicated, and probably at that point, maybe using the file system to manage the prefixes here isn't the right, like, storage medium for such a thing. Like maybe that should be put into a database and let the database manage the ordering, where you can just like drag drop stuff and it'll just like spit out the numbering for you, right? Like that's sort of what I do when it comes to organizing sections and lessons for my courses, right? But in this case of just having like a list of images in a folder or whatever you happen to be, that's why I kind of limited this script just to do that. So with that said, if you have any questions about the script below, or you just want to mention what you might be using it for, please let us know in the comments below. Also, if you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up because it really helps. And on that note, thanks a lot for watching, and I will see you in the next video.